It all started with a coin no one would have looked at twice. A shiny quarter that had been sitting at the bottom of my glove compartment for years, and that single, almost worthless coin changed my life forever, because with it I bought something the world would later call a miracle, a rundown, forgotten cabin deep in the pines that cost me just 25 cents, and though people still laugh when I tell them how it happened, the truth is even stranger than the joke, because I wasn't looking to buy property. I wasn't searching for land. I wasn't even browsing any kind of classified listings the day I stumbled into a dusty estate auction on the edge of town. But fate has a way of steering you into storms you don't see coming. And as I wandered through that barn with rows of mismatched chairs and the smell of old wood and mildew in the air, the auctioneer rattling off numbers for furniture, paintings, and broken tools, I noticed a line in the catalog that seemed more like a typo than reality. Lot Jebber 48, abandoned mountain cabin. Starting bid $0.25. People laughed when it came up. The auctioneer even smirked, calling out the price in a mocking tone as though no one in their right mind would bid. But I felt something stir inside me, a tug, like this was a joke meant for me to answer, so I raised my hand, slid that quarter onto the table, and with a slam of his gavel, the auctioneer declared me the proud owner of a cabin nobody else wanted. And in that moment, the room roared with chuckles and sarcastic congratulations. But none of them could see what that quarter would turn into. None of them could imagine that 1 year later, this shabby cabin hidden away in the wild would be valued at over $10 million. Nor could they have guessed that the HOA, an organization that had no connection to me, no stake in the auction, and no moral claim to the land, would show up at my door demanding I hand it over as though it had been theirs all along, sparking a war that would turn neighbor against neighbor, drag me through courtrooms and back rooms, and reveal secrets about power, greed, and betrayal that would shake the foundations of the entire community. Because when I first drove up to see what I had actually purchased, I expected nothing but rot and ruin, maybe even just a collapsed pile of timber, yet what I found was a cabin that, though rough and weather-beaten, stood defiantly against the decades, perched on the edge of a ridge that looked out over miles of untouched forest, with a view so breathtaking it felt like the world had been holding back its beauty, just for me. And though vines crawled up the side, the porch sagged, and the windows were cracked. The bones of the place whispered of history, of stories untold, and I knew instantly that I had stumbled onto something far more valuable than I had paid, not in money at that moment, but in potential, for this was no ordinary shack. This was a piece of land in a location so pristine and so rare that developers would salivate if they ever got a glimpse of it. So I rolled up my sleeves, took a deep breath of pine-scented air, and decided that even if the world thought I was crazy, I was going to restore this cabin with my own 2 hands. Because sometimes life gives you a quarter and dares you to turn it into a fortune, and I had no idea just how literal that dare would become, because the first few weeks were brutal, stripping moldy boards, clearing brush, hauling debris out, by hand, since no road reached the cabin's doorstep, but each day I discovered more of its hidden charm. A stone fireplace still solid, oak beams that hadn't bowed, even a cellar carved straight into the mountain that stayed cool no matter the season, and as I worked, word began to spread in the nearest town that some fool had bought the old McCarthy place for a quarter and was actually trying to fix it up. People shaking their heads, some curious enough to hike up and gawk, but I didn't care, because sweat and solitude became my companions, and every nail I drove into fresh boards felt like a promise to myself. Until one evening, as the sun dipped and painted the sky in gold and crimson, I stood on the cabin's porch, looked out over the endless green valley below, and realized this wasn't just a cabin anymore. It was a sanctuary, a fortress, and potentially the crown jewel of the entire mountain, though I still didn't know that the soil beneath my boots held a secret that would skyrocket its value. beyond my wildest imagination, because about 3 months into the renovation, after I had patched the roof and restored the main room, I decided to clear a section of overgrown yard, and my shovel hit something hard, something metallic, and after scraping the dirt away, I uncovered an old chest, rusted but intact, locked but not impenetrable, and when I pried it open, I nearly dropped it again, because inside were documents, maps, and a collection of hand-drawn surveys dating back over a century, outlining mineral deposits, water rights, and land boundaries that had been forgotten for generations, including notes suggesting a hidden hot spring beneath the ridge. And not just any spring, but one with high mineral content prized for both medical and luxury purposes. And as I traced the lines on those old papers, I realized the cabin wasn't just valuable as a structure. It sat on top of resources that could make it one of the most sought-after retreats in the state. And that's when I contacted a geologist friend from college, who after a week of surveying confirmed that not only was there a hot spring, but the land around it was sitting on a rare vein of lithium-rich clay, something modern industries were desperate for. And suddenly, the quarter cabin became the talk of investment circles. Whispers of developers wanting to build resorts, wellness centers, even mining companies sniffing around. But I held my ground, rejecting offers left and right, because this was my cabin, my land, and I wasn't going to let greed destroy what I had built. Though that stance quickly painted a target on my back, because where money flows, sharks circle. And the first to show their teeth were not corporate giants, but the local HOA, a group of self-proclaimed guardians of community standards who ran the nearby gated subdivision with iron fists. And though my cabin lay far outside their platted boundaries, they suddenly claimed that the property had once been intended as part of their jurisdiction, waving around flimsy maps and decades-old bylaws as if that gave them ownership, showing up at my door with clipboards and fake smiles, telling me I needed to start paying fees, submit renovation plans for approval, and abide by their endless list of restrictions. But I laughed in their faces, slamming the door, because I knew the law. I had the deed from the auction, and their claims were baseless. Or so I thought, not realizing just how far they would go to twist the system, forge documents, and even infiltrate the county records office to try and snatch the land out from under me. And in that moment, though I didn't know it yet, the war for my quarter cabin had begun. A war that would test every ounce of strength, wit, and resolve I had. And while the world saw a man who had turned a coin into a fortune, I was about to see how quickly fortune could paint a target on your back, and how deep the claws of an HOA could sink when they smelled blood in the water. At first, I thought their visit was a one-time nuisance, a handful of bored suburban bullies with too much time on their hands trying to flex power where it didn't belong. But I underestimated them, because the HOA thrives on control, and when they saw that I wasn't intimidated by their visit, they escalated in ways I couldn't have imagined, beginning with letters that came almost daily, official-looking envelopes stamped with their logo demanding I pay thousands in back dues, citing imaginary bylaws, warning that failure to comply would result in liens against my property. And though I laughed and tossed the letters in the fire, I could feel the pressure mounting, because neighbors started whispering. Trucks parked at the edge of the trail leading to my cabin late at night with headlights off, and people I had once considered friendly acquaintances in town suddenly treated me like a pariah, whispering "squatter" under their breath as I passed. But I pushed on, working day and night on the cabin, installing new windows, sanding the floors until they gleamed, reinforcing the beams, and finally opening the shutters to let sunlight stream into rooms that hadn't seen it in decades. Because with every improvement, the value of the place grew, and soon word spread far beyond our small town. Journalists wanted interviews. Influencers begged to visit. Developers flooded my inbox with offers that grew more outrageous by the week, starting with $50,000 for the land, then $500,000, then $2 million, and finally an offer that made my heart pound, $7.5 million from a luxury resort chain that wanted to buy me out and bulldoze the cabin to build a sprawling spa complex. But I rejected them all, holding firm, because I had fallen in love with this cabin, its history and its serenity. And the thought of handing it over for profit felt like betrayal, not to mention the treasure chest of old documents I had found. Hinted at something deeper, a generational ownership that tied the land to stories long forgotten, a legacy I wanted to uncover, not erase. But the HOA saw my refusal not as strength, but as weakness, assuming I was foolish enough to think sentiment mattered. And so they doubled down, filing paperwork at the county office claiming my cabin was within their extended jurisdiction, attaching forged plats that looked convincing to the untrained eye. And when I tried to protest, the clerk at the office, a woman I'd known since high school, told me in hushed tones that HOA representatives had been coming in daily, pressuring staff, even whining and dining certain officials, and that I needed to watch my back because they weren't playing fair. And that night, as I sat by the fire in the cabin I had built with my own blood and sweat, I realized I wasn't just facing stubborn neighbors. I was up against an organized machine with deep pockets, political connections, and no moral boundaries. And though fear gnawed at me, another part of me burned brighter, defiance. Because I had turned a quarter into a fortune, and I wasn't about to let a pack of suburban tyrants steal it from me. So I resolved then and there to fight, not just with hammer and nails, but with lawyers, evidence, and every ounce of cunning. I had, not realizing that this battle would drag me into darkness far deeper than any forest could hold, where secrets, betrayals, and power games would turn friends into foes and put my very life at risk. Their first attack came quietly, a creeping shadow I only noticed when I woke one morning to find my tools missing. Not stolen entirely, but scattered across the yard as if someone wanted to rattle me more than rob me, nails dumped in the dirt, lumber dragged into the brush, and muddy boot prints leading away from the cabin. And though I reported it to the sheriff, he shrugged, saying it was probably kids messing around. But I knew better. Because the very next day, a fresh letter arrived from the HOA demanding compliance or else we would take enforcement measures ourselves, the timing too perfect to be coincidence, and from that point forward the harassment only grew bolder. Car engines revving in the night at the base of the trail, strange figures caught in the glow of my lantern when I looked out the window, even the sound of someone trying the cabin door at 3 in the morning, sending my pulse racing as I grabbed the shotgun my father had left me, throwing open the doctor only to see retreating silhouettes melt into the trees, and though fear simmered in my gut, anger boiled hotter. Because this was my land, my sanctuary, and I would not be chased off like some trespasser. So I reinforced the doors, set up cameras, and kept pushing forward, documenting every board I nailed, every receipt for supplies, every improvement. Because I knew sooner or later this fight would end up in a courtroom, and sure enough, just as the cabin finally stood restored, polished wood gleaming, porch repaired, roof sturdy against storms, and the hot spring discovery beginning to draw whispers from wellness investors, the HOA served me with a lawsuit. A thick stack of papers accusing me of violating community covenants, claiming I owed them over $80,000 in unpaid dues, fines, and penalties, all based on their forged maps and twisted bylaws. And though I wanted to laugh, the weight of the system hit me when I stood in court the first time, facing their attorney in a $1,000 suit, smug HOA board members lined up behind him like vultures, and a judge who seemed far too cozy with their arguments, cutting me off when I tried to explain that my cabin was never part of their development. But I held my ground, producing the deed from the auction, the surveys I had uncovered, and sworn affidavits from the county historian confirming the land had always been separate. And though the judge begrudgingly delayed the ruling, muttering about further review, I could see the HOA's smirk as if they already knew the game was rigged. And outside the courthouse, one of them leaned close enough for me to smell her perfume and whispered, "Everyone has a price. You'll learn that soon." before walking away with her heels clicking like gunshots against the tile. And in that moment, I realized Section 1 of my battle was closing, the opening shots fired, the first courtroom skirmish drawing lines in the sand. And as the media caught wind, local reporters camping at the trail, snapping pictures of me standing on the cabin's porch with my arms crossed defiantly, the story of the man who bought a cabin for a quarter and now faced an HOA claiming it was theirs began spreading like wildfire. And though people cheered me on, urging me not to give in, I knew cheering wouldn't be enough, because the HOA had resources, connections, and the arrogance of people who had never lost, and I was just one man with a cabin, a coin, and a stubborn refusal to bow. Yet that was enough to ignite a fight that would not only test me, but reveal how rotten the roots of power truly were in our community. And as the first snow of the season dusted the cabin roof and the valley below glistened under moonlight, I stood on the porch gripping the railing, breathing steam into the cold night, and vowed that no matter what it cost, I would not let them steal what I had built, because I had turned 25 cents into $10 million worth of land, legacy, and freedom, and no HOA on earth was going to take that from me without a war they'd regret starting. If the court battle was their formal strike, their sabotage was the dirty war they waged in the shadows, and it reached its peak one freezing January night when I awoke to the crackle of flames and the acrid smell of smoke, bolting upright to see the porch engulfed in fire, someone having doused the boards in accelerant and lit a match, hoping to erase both me and the cabin in one sweep. But adrenaline surged and I grabbed the fire extinguisher, blasting foam until my lungs burned, then tore buckets of snow from outside to smother what was left, coughing and choking but refusing to let the fire win. And by dawn the porch was charred, the air thick with soot, yet the cabin still stood, scarred but alive, just like me. And though the sheriff once again shrugged when I reported it, calling it probably an accident, I knew exactly who was behind it, because the very next day another HOA letter arrived, this one colder than ever. Consider this your final warning. Surrender the property or suffer consequences. And that was the moment something shifted inside me. The fear burning away until only steel remained, because if they wanted war, I would give them war, not with violence, but with evidence, exposure, and every ounce of grit I had. So I doubled down on documentation, hired a private investigator to trace their forgeries, and began leaking pieces of the story to national outlets, who devoured it. Headlines screaming about the man who bought a cabin for 25 cents now worth millions, and HOA bullies try to steal miracle property, turning me overnight from a local oddity into a folk hero. My face plastered across screens, supporters flooding my mailbox with letters of encouragement, even lawyers offering pro bono help just to stand against the tyranny of HOAs. And though that wave of attention gave me strength, it also made the HOA more desperate, their board members suddenly less smug and more venomous, whispering threats in grocery store aisles, slashing my truck tires, even leaving a dead raccoon nailed to a post at the edge of my trail as a grotesque warning. But each move only hardened me further, because the cabin was no longer just mine. It had become a symbol, a rallying point for anyone who had ever been crushed under HOA tyranny, and as I stood on that ridge, the valley spread before me, the hot springs steaming faintly in the winter air. I understood that this was bigger than property, bigger than money, bigger even than me. This was a fight about principle, about whether a person's sweat and courage could still outmatch the machinery of greed. And when I returned to court months later, armed with stacks of documents, photographs of the fire, expert testimony from geologists, and recordings of HOA members making veiled threats, I felt the tide beginning to turn, not in one sweeping victory, but in cracks forming across their facade. Cracks I could drive a wedge into, because as much as they wanted me gone, they had underestimated the resolve of a man who had built a home from ashes, who had taken a coin and turned it into a kingdom, And as the gavel fell that day, the judge postponing yet again, muttering about jurisdictional questions and conflicts of interest, I knew this was only the beginning. The opening act of a war that would span years, courtrooms, and maybe even graves. But I wasn't backing down, and as I drove back up the mountain that evening, headlights carving through the snow, I caught sight of figures at the edge of the tree line, too many to be hikers, their silhouettes still as statues, watching me, waiting, and for the first time, I understood that this fight wasn't going to stay confined to letters, lawsuits, and threats. Something darker was coming. Something that would force me to defend not just my land, but my very life. And as I pulled into the cabin clearing, shotgun across my lap, heart pounding, I whispered into the cold night, "If you want it, come and take it," unaware that by daring them, I had just triggered the next phase of their assault, one that would shake not just my world, but the entire town, and set the stage for a battle no one would ever forget. They came at me not with lawsuits this time, but with uniforms, and that was when I realized the HOA wasn't just a group of nosy neighbors with clipboards. It was a machine willing to wrap itself in the appearance of law to steal what it could, never rightfully own, because one crisp morning, as frost still clung to the grass, I heard the crunch of tires on the frozen trail and stepped onto my porch to see 3 men in sheriff's jackets climb out of a black SUV, badges flashing, hands resting on their belts in a way that screamed intimidation rather than protection, and the tallest of them, a square-jawed man with mirrored sunglasses, announced that they were here to inspect my property for compliance violations, handing me a paper stamped with a county seal. But when I scanned it, I saw errors, misspelled names, outdated codes, and a signature from a judge who had retired 2 years earlier, and my stomach dropped as I realized these weren't deputies at all, but imposters sent by the HOA, dressed up to scare me into handing over control. And though anger surged, I forced calm into my voice, pointing my phone at them as I recorded every word. And when I told them to leave or I'd call the actual sheriff, their smirks faltered. And within minutes, they retreated, muttering curses as they sped off down the trail. But the damage was done, because if they were bold enough to impersonate law enforcement, there was no telling how far they would go next. And sure enough, that same week, the local news carried a smear piece on me, claiming I was an illegal squatter who had tricked his way into stealing land, a narrative clearly fed to the reporter by the HOA, because the segment cut away to their president, a woman named Marlene Haskins, speaking with crocodile tears about how I was endangering the community by refusing to follow rules, how I was hoarding valuable natural resources that should benefit everyone. And as I watched her performance, bile rose in my throat, because she wasn't just twisting facts. She was laying the groundwork to paint me as a villain in the eyes of the entire town. But what she didn't count on was that the story spread far beyond our little community, picked up by larger outlets who dug deeper and uncovered the truth. Headlines now reading, "HOA president caught using fake cops to harass landowner." And while that gave me a temporary boost of support, it also brought unwanted attention. Strangers hiking up the trail hoping to snap photos of the quarter cabin, drones buzzing overhead, and slick-haired developers showing up at diners in town trying to buy influence. And in the middle of it all, I found myself staring at the faces of people I had once trusted, realizing that the fight was eroding every bond I had, because one evening as I sat with a whiskey in hand, staring into the fire, my closest friend from childhood, a man named Travis who had helped me in the early days of repairs, showed up unannounced, claiming he just wanted to check in, but something in his eyes gave him away, darting toward my desk where the old maps and mineral surveys were spread out. And when I confronted him, he stammered excuses, saying he was only curious. But I knew the HOA had gotten to him, bribed him, maybe threatened him, and the betrayal cut deeper than any lawsuit ever could, because if even Travis could be turned, who else was already feeding them information? And sure enough, within days, confidential details about my cabin, things only Travis had known, were showing up in HOA filings, their lawyers twisting my own words against me. And though the betrayal nearly broke me, it also sharpened my resolve, because I understood now that this wasn't just about property. It was about power. And power corrupted even those who once stood by your side. So I drew the line harder than ever, telling Travis never to set foot near me again. Then doubling down on my defense, hiring a team of young, hungry attorneys who believed in the cause, who sifted through every fraudulent document and every corrupt transaction, preparing to bring the HOA not just to a standstill, but to its knees, though I knew it would not be that simple, because Marlene and her cronies had no intention of playing fair, and as spring thawed the snow and the valley bloomed again, I received a certified letter that chilled me more than any winter wind. Notice of eminent domain proceedings, filed in cooperation with the county board, claiming my land was being seized for public benefit. A move clearly orchestrated by the HOA to bypass me altogether. And in that moment, I felt the world tilt. Because this wasn't just harassment anymore. They were trying to erase me from the map, legally bulldoze my ownership, and though rage nearly blinded me, I steadied myself with the same thought that had carried me since the day I bought the cabin. I may have paid 25 cents, but I will never sell, never surrender. And if they think they can take this from me, they're about to learn just how dangerous a man with nothing to lose can be. The smear campaign backfired in ways Marlene hadn't expected, because once the larger outlets sniffed out the fraud and corruption, they devoured the HOA like wolves, national anchors debating the absurdity of a group of neighbors trying to claim land bought legally for 25 cents, investigative journalists digging into the HOA's history and finding a trail of abuses, elderly homeowners fined for bird feeders, veterans threatened with foreclosure over garden flags, single. Mothers harassed for leaving toys in their yards, and suddenly my fight wasn't just mine anymore. It became the symbol of every American tired of being strangled by petty tyrants with clipboards, hashtags trending on social media, petitions circulating, people hiking up to the cabin just to take selfies with me like I was some folk hero. And though I smiled for cameras, inside I was exhausted. Because attention didn't stop the harassment. It intensified it, drones buzzing louder, trespassers more brazen, developers sending envoys who spoke in veiled threats rather than offers, and worst of all, the county board, once neutral, suddenly began to lean openly toward the HOA, their meetings filled with Marlene's rhetoric about community benefit, resolutions passed overnight without notice, public records quietly altered, and when I cornered one board member I'd known for years, he refused to meet my eyes, mumbling that pressure from above tied his hands, which only confirmed my suspicion that bribes and backroom deals were flowing like water, and I knew if I wanted to win I couldn't just play defense anymore, I had to go on the attack. So I started digging, combing through county ledgers, property tax rolls, campaign finance reports, and sure enough, the rot was everywhere. Board members receiving consulting fees from developers aligned with the HOA, zoning exceptions granted to Marlene's relatives, and even a suspicious land transfer where one board member had sold her backyard to the HOA for 10 times market value, and when I compiled the evidence into a dossier and handed it off to a national reporter who had been camping near the cabin. For weeks, the story exploded like dynamite, headlines screaming, HOA president caught in land bribery scandal and county board under fire for corruption. And for the first time, I saw cracks in their armor. Marlene looking less polished. On camera, board members ducking reporters, whispers of resignations behind closed doors. But their desperation only made them more dangerous, because just when I thought the tide was turning, I walked into court one morning to find my lead attorney pale-faced, holding a folder of new evidence submitted overnight, fabricated documents suggesting I had forged the auction deed, that I had colluded with the auctioneer to cheat the county out of rightful property, lies so elaborate They would have taken weeks to prepare, yet here they were dumped at the 11th hour, and the judge, clearly eager to wash his hands of the case, admitted them into record, and for a sickening moment, I felt the ground tilt under me, the courthouse spinning as if the HOA had finally outplayed me. But then I noticed a single detail they had overlooked, a date on one forged receipt that didn't match reality, referencing a zoning ordinance that hadn't even existed at the time. And though my lawyer whispered for me to stay calm, a fire lit inside me as I stood and addressed the court directly, my voice shaking not from fear but from fury, calling out the forgery in front of the packed gallery, cameras clicking, reporters scribbling, and though the judge tried to silence me, the damage was done. The lie exposed, the HOA caught in their own trap. And as murmurs spread through the courtroom, Marlene's mask cracked for the first time, her smug smile slipping into something cold, predatory, as if to say, "You may have survived this round, but you don't know what's coming next." And she was right, because even as my legal team celebrated outside, I received a text from an unknown number, a blurry photo of the cabin, at night with the words, "Last warning, leave or burn," and that was when I understood the fight was no longer confined to paper and courts. It was about to spill into the shadows where rules meant nothing and survival meant everything. They thought fear would drive me from the cabin, that a midnight photo and a coward's threat would shake me harder than 100 lawsuits. But when I stood on that porch with the scent of pine sharp in the cold air and my old shotgun cradled across my arms, I realized that fear no longer had a place in me. That quarter I had laid down in a dusty auction barn had already bought me more than a cabin. It had bought me defiance. And when the first act of sabotage came, sugar poured into the generator fuel, a back window smashed, strange tire tracks in the dirt, I patched it all up with my own hands and sent the photos to every journalist I knew. And the more they hit me, the more public support surged, because America loves an underdog. And now I wasn't just some fool who bought a shack for a coin. I was the man who stood against a machine, the face on morning shows, the viral story that wouldn't die. But that attention painted an even bigger target on me, and one night when the moon was low, fire raced through the brush near the cabin, torches hurled from the shadows, the crackle of flames a terrifying reminder that the HOA was done playing games. They wanted me erased, but I had prepared. I had cleared brush, dug a fire break, kept water barrels ready, and though the blaze licked close, the cabin stood unscathed, smoke rising like a signal to the heavens that I would not bow. And the next morning footage of me beating back the flames with nothing but buckets and grit flooded. The news, donations pouring in, legal foundations offering aid, and still the HOA pushed harder. Marlene rallying her dwindling troops with speeches about protecting property values. County officials trembling as subpoenas rained down from federal. Investigators who had caught wind of the forged documents and bribes. And by the time hearings began in the Capitol, the HOA board was splintered. Some members cutting deals to save themselves, others stubbornly clinging to Marlene's sinking ship. And I watched her walk into that grand marble courthouse draped in designer clothes she could no longer afford, chin high, eyes burning with hatred because she knew the truth was coming for her. And when the prosecutor laid out the evidence, fraud, extortion, arson, conspiracy, it was like peeling scales off a serpent, every layer revealing a darker crime. And though she spat denials, swore it was all a witch hunt, the gallery of neighbors, journalists, and former victims of her reign roared with satisfaction. As the judge banged his gavel ordering her held without bail, the HOA formally dissolved by state order, their assets seized, their legacy reduced to ash, and in that moment you would think my battle ended. But victory carries its own burdens. Because the sudden valuation of the land, now over 10 million thanks to mineral rights and development interest, attracted a new breed of predator, corporations, out-of-state investors, even federal agencies whispering about eminent domain, and once again I faced the choice. sell out for riches, or stand firm for principle, and though my bank account had been bled dry over a year of fighting, though I could have walked away with a fortune, I chose the cabin, the land, the quarter that had given me not wealth, but purpose. And when I announced on live television that the cabin and surrounding acres would be placed in a trust as a public refuge, preserved forever against greed, the applause felt like thunder rolling down the mountains, neighbors hiking up to plant flowers, veterans raising flags, children splashing in the creek, and for the first time in a year I felt peace settle in. My chest because I had beaten them. Not just Marlene, not just the HOA, but the very idea that paper tyrants could steal a man's life with a fine or a threat. And as the sun set behind the peaks, gold spilling over the pines and reflecting in the cabin's worn windows, I reached into my pocket, pulled out that same quarter, rubbed the worn surface with my thumb and laughed. Not because of the money I'd turned down or the empire I'd toppled, but because sometimes the smallest coin can buy the greatest victory. And as I stood there on my porch, smoke from the last fire long since faded, I knew this wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a legend, one quarter, one cabin, one man who refused to bend, and a warning carved into history that no HOA, no greedy developer, no corrupt official would ever forget. Because the cabin worth $10 million had never truly been about money. It had been about freedom, and freedom once bought can never again be sold.